Imagine an airport, the quiet hum of voices, passengers hurrying to their flights. At that moment, a tall colonel walks down the hall, his face focused and full of dignity. He is not an ordinary passenger. He fulfills his sacred duty, accompanying the remains of a fallen soldier. But suddenly, as if out of the blue, he is denied a flight. Him, a man in uniform, a man of honor. Imagine how he felt at that moment. Why was he denied? What happened next? You'll have to see for yourself. While you're here, dear viewers, let us know about you. Write in the comments what your name is and where you are watching this video from. You are an important part of our channel, and every opinion and comment you make helps us grow, helps us tell stories that resonate with our hearts. We incredibly appreciate each and every one of you and are happy to see you with us. This story is for you, as is everything we create here. Colonel Thomas Bryant stood in the general's office, accepting a heavy assignment that could only fall on the shoulders of a man. With a true sense of duty and honor, his battle-scarred uniform fit him like a second skin, immaculate and always ready for any challenge. The assignment was special, to escort the remains of a young soldier who had given his life in the service. This soldier was part of his unit, served under his command, and the colonel felt a special connection to him, not just as a commander, but as a man who had survived all the horrors they had seen together on the front line. Thomas Bryant was ready for this mission, not just as an officer. He saw it as a personal duty, as a promise he had once made to all his men. If someone doesn't come home, I will do everything I can to keep his memory alive. This fallen soldier was one of the best, young, full of strength and courage. He served with total sacrifice, and now he was waiting at home, waiting to do his last duty, to say goodbye and pray for his repose. The colonel knew how important this moment was to his family, to his friends, and to their entire unit. Having received his orders, the colonel saluted and went to prepare for the trip. He understood that accompanying the remains of a comrade was not just a symbolic act. It is a hero's homecoming. It is his own duty to the fallen. The preparation was almost ritualistic. He checked his uniform, adjusted his medals, each time feeling their weight as the weight of responsibility. Every detail was important. He knew that every medal, every chevron on his uniform, every movement must reflect the respect he felt for the fallen. As the day of departure approached, Thomas realized how different this flight was from all his past missions and trips. He was to spend not just time in the sky, but as if guarding his spirit. He looked at the coming journey as more than just a road. It was the last step they would walk together. Colonel Thomas Bryant walked confidently into the airport building. His tall, uniformed figure immediately attracted the attention of those around him. It would seem that so many times he had seen people at airports hurrying, rushing to their gates, concentrating on their business, that he could have remained unnoticed, as if he were one of the many passengers. But this time was different. He felt other people's gazes on him, assessing, cold, at times even openly hostile. He hadn't paid much attention to it at first. Airports were always bustling places, and people often stopped for a moment to glance at someone in uniform. But with each step, each new glance, Thomas sensed that something more was going on here. Some passengers met his gaze and hastily averted their eyes. Others, on the contrary, held their gaze, as if trying to understand or decide something for themselves. Passers-by seemed to find his presence alien in this place, uninvited, perhaps even frightening. As he walked through the wide halls, the colonel noticed some of the mothers clutching their children tied to them, and a few of the men were obviously watching his movements intently. Bryant felt the air around him grow colder, as he somehow found himself the center of attention in the bustle, as if he were standing under a spotlight. There was something elusive in their eyes, a mixture of weariness, distrust, and perhaps an echo of fear. The sensation made him uneasy, but Thomas didn't let it show. Keeping his posture as he always did, he realized he had to remain calm and collected. His personal mission was too important to let any casual glances or ill-intentioned thoughts distract him. But ignoring the tension in the air was getting harder by the minute. When he approached the front desk, the employee frowned for a moment when he saw him in full uniform. The young man's face showed something like confusion, which was quickly replaced by a cold, neutral politeness. The colonel said hello, clearly stated his details, and held out his documents. The officers silently took them and scrutinized them, occasionally casting strange glances at Bryant. As the check-in process dragged on, Thomas noticed the employees at the counter exchanging brief glances with each other. With something that could not be called mere business interest, they were discussing something quietly, As if hesitant to look up, Brian sensed that this exchange was about him. Something, perhaps, had to do with his uniform or the fact that he was here, alone, in the role of escorting the remains. The problem wasn't just the unfriendly stares, but the way the people around him began to slow down, linger near him, as if something unusual was drawing their attention. People gathered in groups nearby, glimpsing him, as if expecting to see something that would justify their suspicions. He sensed their silent accusations, though he did not understand the reason for them. Brian tried to focus, reminded himself that he was doing his duty and that his purpose was more important than the occasional unfriendly glance. But this environment was eroding his confidence, giving him a strange, unpleasant feeling. For some reason, the simple act of checking in for a flight had become an ordeal, every moment of which was permeated with an undercurrent of hostility, as if he didn't belong here, among these people. While the young man was doing the paperwork, Thomas looked around involuntarily. People, as if in silent, invisible uniforms, continued to watch him, and this only increased his anxiety. The young man behind the counter finally returned his gaze to the colonel, his face maintaining a strained, polite smile that was tense, taking Thomas's papers. However, he was in no hurry to complete the registration. Instead, he looked Brian over from top to bottom, as if trying to find something in his appearance to question. Colonel Bryant, right, he said, frowning slightly, as if the rank didn't match the man in front of him. The colonel nodded, expecting that the documents would finally be checked and he would be able to proceed to his flight. But, to his surprise, the officers averted his eyes for a second and said, hesitating, "You see, sir, the thing is, your presence is causing some inconvenience." He paused, not looking Thomas in the eye, as if he knew his words would hurt, but he was going to say them anyway. "Passengers may feel uncomfortable around you." The colonel tensed involuntarily. For the first time in a long time, he felt a rush of bewilderment and then resentment. Inconvenience. Mentally he repeated, why could he and officers, a man accompanying the remains of a soldier, be perceived as the source of any inconvenience? He tried to keep his composure, holding back the tension in his voice. "I would like to clarify, what exactly do you think this inconvenience is?" The young man shrugged his shoulders and looked at his colleague standing next to him. They exchanged glances for a second, and he nodded, as if approving of his further actions. "You see," the employee continued, searching for words, "we have a strict policy here. We cannot allow passengers to feel uncomfortable because of, possible stereotypes." He said the word stereotypes almost in a whisper, but it hung in the air like a vivid accusation. The word hit his skin color, his background, his every trait that these people thought made him uncomfortable. Thomas gazed into the young man's face, hoping to see even a shadow of realization that he was saying this to a colonel in the United States Army, a man who was not here for himself, but to bring a fallen man home. But there was nothing of the sort on the officer's face, just a cold, unconfident confidence in the right to refuse. "To her, don't misunderstand," added another employee, a middle-aged woman who had pulled up to the counter. She looked at him with the same scrutinizing expression, as if she saw him not just as a passenger but as a potential threat. "There are families here, children. They might be uncomfortable. Perhaps we should arrange another flight for you, something that would suit you better." Thomas realized, despite his uniform, his rank, they saw him only as an outsider who didn't belong here, an outsider whose presence deviated from the norm. Perhaps they thought that his uniform was just a cover, that there could be no dignity or honor behind it. His face remained calm, but something inside was burning, protesting the absurdity and injustice of the situation. "Do you realize," he said at last, trying to keep his tone even, "that I am escorting the remains of a fallen soldier, your compatriot? I'm on a mission. It is my duty." The staff exchanged glances, as if considering his words, but did not hurry to change their minds. The woman nodded dryly, as if he had reminded her of a mundane detail, and said, "Your mission is certainly important, but we have an obligation to consider the feelings of other passengers. Perhaps you should wait for the next flight, where there are fewer people." Those words sounded like a judgment. It was a hint that he was not only not wanted, he was literally denied his right to be among them, regardless of rank or mission. The colonel felt the words stuck in his throat, but he swallowed them, realizing that it was useless to fight such an attitude. He was denied not as a passenger, but as a person whose existence was perceived as something undesirable, foreign in this place. His gaze lingered on the young man behind the counter. As if testing him, the employee kept his eyes on him, but there was something of a hidden victory in his face. Colonel Bryant approached the cash register to try to solve the problem, at least to find out what the reason for such treatment was. In front of him stood a young woman with brightly painted lips and a strained, polite smile that concealed a familiar coldness. She looked silently at his uniform and then at his face, as if searching for some incongruity in it. Her gaze seemed to be filled with a mixture of prejudice and indifference. "What can I do for you?" she asked, but there was no sincerity in her voice. As if the question were a ritual she wanted to get rid of as soon as possible. "I need to confirm my boarding for the flight," the colonel said, remaining calm, though tension was building inside him. The woman took his ticket and glanced quickly at the computer screen. A slight nod. Then her eyes returned to Brian's face, and there was something new in them, subtle but openly hostile, as if his rank and uniform meant nothing to her ingrained prejudices. "I'm sorry, sir, but it appears your ticket is no longer valid," she said, barely containing a smirk. "Not valid," he interjected, feeling indignation slowly rising in his chest. "Is this some kind of glitch? I bought the ticket and checked in." The woman shrugged slightly, not looking away from the screen, and said with icy calmness, "Your ticket is no longer on our list. It must have been cancelled." She said it with such carelessness, as if his situation didn't bother her at all. The colonel noticed that she didn't even look in his direction, avoiding his gaze as if he were something unpleasant or even dangerous. Another passenger behind him coughed, shuffling impatiently from foot to foot, and Brian felt the others watching him closely. "I'm escorting the remains of a soldier," he said firmly, trying to keep his voice low. "This is no ordinary flight for me. I need to get on this plane." The woman frowned faintly, as if the phrase was unpleasant to her. She cast a quick glance at her colleague at the counter, and he nodded briefly, confirming her further action. "Sir," her voice became a little firmer, as if she wanted to put a stop to this conversation. "Your presence on this flight is causing difficulties. There may be another flight for you, but this one is full." The colonel noticed how her face contorted slightly when she said the word complexities. He realized that her refusal was not a simple administrative decision. She was deliberately denying him a favor, not even trying to hide her bias. Her eyes, her mannerisms, her whole demeanor told him that she saw him as an outsider, a man she felt had no place among the other passengers. Brian tried to object, but the woman cut him off abruptly, raising her voice so the others could hear. "Sir, you're causing a problem. I've asked you to wait for the next flight or seek help from another representative. Your ticket here is invalid." The people around him began to whisper, and some cast quick, reproachful glances at him, as if he were a troublemaker. An atmosphere of silent condemnation formed around him. The passengers were no longer mere spectators. Their gazes became more intense, tense, as if they were waiting for him to make a mistake or justify why he was here among them. "What exactly is the problem?" he asked, still hoping for a logical explanation. But the woman just looked at him condescendingly, as if his question were irrelevant. "We're just following the rules, sir," she hissed, emphasizing the word rules so that it sounded like a sentence. "And some passengers may not appreciate your presence." These words were a blatant challenge. He realized that to her he was not a colonel, not an officer doing his duty, but merely an undesirable element. He was to her something alien, something to be avoided. Seeing that Brian wasn't going to leave, the employee squeezed out a strained smile and added to set the record straight, "Please do not complicate the situation. We cannot guarantee your safety on board." Those words were the last straw. Colonel Bryant, a man who had devoted his life to the defense of his country, heard that he could not be guaranteed safety. The words, which in another context might have sounded like a formal precaution, here sounded like a warning. His presence was so dangerous that it was better he wasn't here at all. Colonel Bryant frowned. He had always felt that the uniform was his armor. It symbolized honor, duty, and an unshakable bond with the people that served. But at this moment, standing in front of the cold reception desk, he began to realize that to these men, his rank and duty didn't matter. His surroundings, his own country that he was defending, looked at him differently through a prism of prejudice, in which all his dignity was nullified by his appearance, his skin color, his nationality. Trying to realize what was really going on, Thomas took his eyes off the counter and looked around. His gaze slid over the faces of the people who were still watching him tensely, glancing furtively and whispering, as if they saw a threat rather than the colonel. He caught the sound of a man standing nearby with his family saying quietly to his wife, "That's why I said you shouldn't fly here. The last few years here, not the best passengers, if you know what I mean." As if to confirm this, the woman at the counter glanced at her colleague, then looked at Thomas again, a subtle tinge of contempt in her eyes. She saw him as an outsider, as if he were in a territory where he had no place. An elderly couple appeared nearby. The woman, short and wearing a brightly colored cloak, said to her companion in a whisper, but loud enough for Thomas to hear, "I don't know what he's doing here in a uniform. I thought this was for real military. Must be a mistake." Her voice sounded deliberately loud, as if she was trying to get the people around her to support her doubts and indignation. The words of the ordinary passengers, their looks and gestures, all pointed to one thing. He was just the wrong man in the wrong place to them. He didn't need confirmation. From the ticket office staff, it was enough to see the silent conspiracy in the eyes of those who felt entitled to judge him by his appearance. Thomas turned to the counter and for the last time, holding back his voice, said, "I deserve an explanation. What's the reason for the refusal?" The woman at the counter looked at him coldly, her gaze sliding over his face as if testing the limits of his patience. "Sir," she shrugged her shoulders with a subtle shrug and a note of indifference in her tone, "we are not obliged to comment on the decision to cancel the ticket airline policy." It was clear from her words that he could have spent the whole day here and she wouldn't have responded either ways. They had already made up their minds, and his nationality, his looks, and even his uniform were all things that made him inappropriate in her eyes. Thomas had seen a lot of injustice in his years of service, but he hadn't expected to face it so openly in his home, in an environment that seemed previously immune to prejudice. At that moment, another passenger approached the counter, a middle-aged man who apparently couldn't stand the curiosity. He stood next to him and gave Thomas a less than friendly look. "Excuse me," the man said, turning to the female employee, "I don't know what you're doing here, but some of us are in a hurry. Maybe you should help those who really want to fly." The colonel felt his face stiffen. This man, without even knowing the facts of the case, had immediately put him in the position of an intruder, a troublemaker who didn't deserve the right to be here. The man looked at him with blatant disdain, as if Thomas's presence was an affront to his personal space. The employee smiled demurely at the man, radiating a warmth and understanding that Thomas had not noticed in all his time with her. "Thank you for your patience," she said to the man, and then shifted her gaze back to Thomas. "Sir, you're really holding up the line. We need to clear the counter." Those words were the final blow. Thomas realized that to them he was nothing more than a nuisance, regardless of his merit, his rank, his uniform, or the purpose of his trip. They saw only a man who did not fit their idea of who was worthy of this flight. And as he stood there, surrounded by disgruntled passengers and staff who coldly refused to serve him, Colonel Bryan realized the bitter truth. His status, mission, and even his dedicated service meant nothing to them, because in their eyes, he was just the wrong man who didn't deserve to be part of the world. One by one, the passengers in line behind him cast unhappy glances at him. He was a source of inconvenience to them, an unnecessary burden that they felt had no place here. Colonel Bryan took a deep breath, trying to contain his growing resentment. He wasn't used to explaining the obvious, but in this situation he had no choice. Trying to remain calm, he turned to the woman behind the counter again. "Listen," he began, trying to keep his voice steady and calm. "I'm not here for personal comfort. I'm escorting the remains of a soldier, doing my last duty to a fallen comrade, bringing him home to his family. This flight is not just transportation for me. It is part of a mission that I must fulfill." He said the words clearly, trying to emphasize the importance of his mission, so that it would not be ignored. He hoped that the explanation would remind the staff that he was not just a passenger, but a man performing a sacred duty. But the woman only sighed, looking at him with an expression of distant boredom, as if the words about duty, honor, and bringing the fallen home had no meaning to her. "Sir, I understand," she said with an icy, mechanical politeness, as if she'd said it more than once all day. "But, as I said, rules are rules. Your flight was canceled. and we are not allowed by company policy to reinstate it." The colonel could hardly contain his indignation. Her indifference was almost insulting to him. To her, his words meant no more than a formality, as if it were just an unimportant detail, rather than an act of deep respect for a fallen soldier. "Company policy," Thomas repeated, his voice trembling slightly with restrained anger. "Do you really think company policy is more important than respecting the memory of a soldier who died for his country?" The woman reacted to his words as if he had asked something ridiculous or inappropriate. She looked at the colleague next to her, as if looking for support, and he immediately rushed to add his opinion. "Sir, let's be honest. This is not a military base, and we have no obligation to take into account all of your—" He hesitated, choosing his words, "circumstances." Brian felt something inside him flare up. He had given decades of service to his country, had been through so much, to be faced with such indifference and blatant disregard here, among his own people. "This circumstance, as you say, is in memory of a man who gave his life defending you and your freedom," he said, looking directly into the eyes of both officers. But instead of respect, or even understanding, he saw a cold, almost contemptuous expression in the eyes of the staff. It was as if he were speaking a foreign language, a language they were not going to understand. Thomas looked around and noticed that their conversation had attracted even more attention. People were whispering, glancing at him. Some shook their heads, some pointed fingers at him, but no one tried to intervene or support him. "I'm not asking for special privileges," he continued, his voice firm, but already a note of desperation. "I'm asking for respect for the man who gave his life. You realize this isn't just a flight from me." The woman shook her head, and a look of contempt or weariness flashed in her eyes. She looked at him as if he were a capricious customer, demanding the impossible. "Sir, I've already told you." Her voice was like ice, not a shred of sympathy in it. "You need to choose another flight, or, if you think your mission is so important, contact the specialized services. We can't make exceptions just because you—" She hesitated, choosing her words. "Think it's important to you." Colonel Brian clenched his fists. Her words cut into his pride and sense of justice, but he knew it would be useless to lose his temper, even if he shouted about his rank, his uniform, his mission. It meant nothing in their eyes. All they saw was someone who, in their opinion, deserved no concessions. He tried again. "You really don't understand. I'm escorting the remains of a soldier. I'm not asking for something special for me. It's for him, for his family, for his country." But the woman behind the counter only snorted, and there was something almost gloating in her face. "You might want to consider, sir, that some people would be more comfortable without situations like this." The words sounded like a slap in the face. Thomas realized that his appeals to honor and duty were useless here. They saw him not as an officer, not as a man on a mission, but as someone who did not fit their norms and rules, someone who could be more easily pushed away and forgotten. Colonel Bryant, without another word, felt a cold, deafening pain seize him inside. The pain of knowing that everything he had defended, here among his own, had no meaning. Colonel Thomas Bryant stood in front of the reception desk, trying to keep his voice steady and calm, but the sense of humiliation, bitter and all-consuming, would not let him go. A proud officer who had dedicated his life to service was now forced to beg with the courtesy, the respect that he thought should have been natural to his mission. He had to do it under the gaze of down scenes of strangers who saw him not as an officer, not as a man with a worthy task, but as a mere nuisance in their peaceful lives. "Please," Thomas said, bowing his head slightly, trying to hide the hurt, the resentment, and the anger that he knew would not help matters. "Please, this is really important. You know I can't afford to be late. Understand me. I'm only asking you to consider the possibility of—" He paused, swallowing with difficulty the words that seemed humiliating to him. It was hard for him, an officer, to stoop to such a request, but duty compelled him to override his own pride. He knew honor was at stake, but now it was replaced by a desperate plea. The woman behind the counter didn't even look at him. Her face remained indifferent, as if she were not a U.S. Army officer, but just another inconvenient passenger who could be sent away more easily. She flipped through a few pages of her notes with cold nonchalance, clearly not even bothering to really look at them, and finally said, "Sir, I already told you that's impossible. You're breaking the rules. We can make an exception." Her voice sounded detached and slightly annoyed. as if she were explaining obvious things to a child. She didn't even try to hide the disdain in her words. Thomas spoke again, suppressing a flash of anger within himself. I address you with respect, as someone who understands that I'm not here for myself. I'm asking you to show me the same respect. He stopped, feeling the words catch in his throat. A little sympathy. The woman grinned and looked at him with outright contempt. You know, sir, we've got a lot of people here, all with their own reasons for going. You can't expect to be given a special exception just because you think your mission is important. Thomas heard someone snorting behind him. He didn't turn around, but he realized that the passengers gathered around him were against him. They didn't see him as a man with a mission. They only saw him as a problem to be removed from their path. Please, Thomas said again, feeling his voice begin to tremble. It was a last request, a last attempt to reach them. I'm not asking for privilege. I'm just asking for help. He swallowed a bitter lump of humiliation as he said those words he was not supposed to say. The man who stood guard over their safety was now forced to ask for what should have been given to him by right. His request sounded almost like a plea, but the woman behind the counter looked at him as if he had insulted her with his treatment. She leaned forward slightly, looked at him with an icy grin, and said loudly, so that those around her could hear, Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the waiting area. You are disruptive and disturbing other passengers. Your behavior is unacceptable. Those words sounded like a verdict. She didn't just refuse him, she humiliated him in a way that everyone in the room could understand. To her he was nothing, even if he wore a uniform and a rank. In her eyes, he was a man who was in the way of others, a man who shouldn't be here. Colonel Bryan felt the weight of their prejudice, their contemptuous glances, and their derogatory words fall upon him. A man, an officer, a soldier, had no choice but to stand there under those stares and silently accept their humiliation. As Colonel Bryant, feeling deafeningly humiliated and resentful, stood before the reception desk, a voice came from outside. It was an elderly man, gray-haired and reserved, who had obviously witnessed what was happening. He approached the counter, indignation and deep concern evident on his face. Excuse me, miss, he turned to the employee, giving her a stern look. But do you realize you're looking at an officer's on an important mission? This is not some random tourist. He's escorting the remains of a soldier. I think he should be honored, not pushed out of the waiting area. The woman behind the counter, hearing this comment, looked up and replied with a cold politeness, in which irritation was evident. Sir, we follow our rules and internal guidelines. We have no grounds for exceptions, and this applies to all passengers, regardless of their purposes or missions. In that case, the older man spoke again, not hiding his indignation. Your rules violate basic respect for those who serve this country. This man deserves to be treated with dignity. A middle-aged woman standing nearby joined in his words. She looked troubled and stepped decisively closer, picking up the conversation. This is outrageous, she said, turning to the counter and nodding toward the colonel at the same time. This man deserves our respect. His mission is sacred. You can't treat him like this just because it doesn't fit your ideal image of a passenger. Her words provoked reactions among the other people in the queue, some of whom began to nod, supporting her point of view. The atmosphere in the waiting room began to heat up. People were whispering, discussing the unfair treatment the colonel was facing. But the airport staff apparently had no intention of relenting. The woman at the counter raised her chin, signaling that her patience was wearing thin. Please don't interface, she said sharply, addressing anyone who tried to stand up for the colonel. We have strict procedures, and we have to follow them. If anyone wants to express their displeasure, please do so in an official way. But right now I'm asking you to stop making a mess. The older man was clearly in no mood to back down and stepped closer to the counter. Disorder is when you deprive a man of his right to do his duty. You can call it whatever you want, but it is an injustice, and we all see it. He was joined by another young man who came closer and, addressing the female employee, stated, if it had been someone else, not the colonel or a man of his appearance, you wouldn't be acting like this. We all see it. It's blatant bias. The woman behind the counter narrowed her eyes, her face tense. She clearly hadn't expected such open indignation. Apparently supporting the colonel and exposing their unfair treatment was starting to make her nervous, and she responded stiffly, if you continue to interface, we will be forced to call security. Anyone disturbing the order will be forced to leave the airport building. There was a metallic tinge of threat in her voice, and her words immediately chilled some people. She used her power to quell the growing discontent, playing on the fact that no one wanted to miss their flight and run into trouble. The older man, realizing the consequences, looked at the colonel with regret and clenched his teeth. He wanted to say something else, but apparently realized that if he continued to insist, he would find himself in the same vulnerable position. Thomas Bryant felt a mixture of gratitude and helplessness in his chest. People had stood up for him, despite the risk to themselves, but even that support had been shattered by the indifference and overbearingness of the staff, who clung to their right to deny him without regard for his mission or merit. The situation reached a critical point when two security officers approached the counter. Their faces were stern and impassive, and there was not even a hint of respect or understanding in their gaze. Colonel Thomas Bryant felt all eyes in the room directed at him. These men, his countrymen, those for whom he had sacrificed his life and safety, were now looking at him with suspicion and prejudice, as if he were an intruder, not an officer doing his last duty for a fallen soldier. "Sir, come with us," said one of the guards, a tall man with a cold, frankly contemptuous look. He gestured toward the exit of the check-in area, as if escorting a criminal. Thomas took a deep breath, trying to maintain his dignity and fortitude, but bitterness and pain boiled up inside him. Never had he imagined that his own country, the one he had served all his life, would greet him with such humiliating measures. He was not just a passenger, not just a citizen, he was a colonel, a man dedicated to protecting these people, their quiet lives, but now he had to go under escort, like a trespasser or even a criminal. When he didn't move immediately, the second guard, a young man with barely concealed sarcasm in his gaze, said stiffly, "Are you going to come with us voluntarily, or are we going to have to take you out by force?" The words sounded almost like a challenge. He knew they were waiting for the slightest sign of resistance, to use their power to show everyone around them that they were right. At this, officers, this man did not deserve respect. Thomas held back a surge of anger and walked forward, accompanied by the two guards who flanked him, as if he were a threat to airport security. Passengers continued to cast judgmental glances his way, some whispering, some openly disdainful. Someone even took out their phone to record him being escorted out. He held his head high with anger, but inside he felt his pride and dignity being trampled into dust with every step. On the way, one of the guards, with a face full of hidden contempt, dropped, "I don't know how you got there in uniform. You have to earn your way into those positions. You know." There was a barely concealed sneer in his voice. The words humiliated him more deeply than mere disparaging treatment. He was in officers who had earned every medal, every chevron on his uniform, but to these men, his rank was nothing more than an empty formality, not worthy of respect. As they approached the exit of the waiting area, the second guard, noticing the colonel's uniform and medals, said with a chuckle, "You must think it means something, don't you? All these medals. It might matter to someone elsewhere, but here, we don't see it." In that moment, Thomas realized that his uniform, his rank, and his mission were all for naught here. His service, his merit, his dedication meant nothing to these men. They saw him as a mere appearance, as a man who, in their opinion, was nothing more than a superfluous nuisance that did not feed into their picture of the world. The guard stopped before the exit, and one of them, as if deliberately raising his voice so that those around him could hear, added, "That's what happens when people think their past means something. We have our own rules here. Understand, sir, rank does not absolve you from following them." Those words were like a blow to the wind. Thomas knew they were deliberately humiliating him, creating an atmosphere where his rank and accomplishments were insignificant, where everything he had defended and risked his life for was meaningless. When they finally escorted him to the exit of the check-in area, one of the guards said in a subdued, almost solemn voice, "I hope you realize we're doing this for the sake of general order. If everyone exercised your so-called privilege, we'd have chaos here. Have a good day, Colonel. Maybe you can find another flight where you're," he paused, searching for a word. "Mission will make a difference." With these words they turned and walked away, leaving Thomas standing all alone at the entrance to the hall. His last attempt to preserve his honor and dignity had been trampled upon. His pride, his officer's rank, had been reduced to nothing in the face of this humiliating injustice. As soon as the guards left Bryant at the entrance to the hall, the atmosphere at the airport began to change quickly. Some of those who witnessed what was happening took out their phones and started recording, and some already managed to post the footage on social media, signing it with angry comments. People around them seemed to increasingly realize the depth of the injustice that had just happened before their eyes. They saw how a man who had earned respect and honor was humiliated as if he were a stranger in his native land. "It's the colonel," the woman whispered, turning to her friend. "Did you see the way they treated him? They didn't even let him explain himself. They just pushed him out like he was a criminal." The man standing next to him, who had previously remained neutral, shook his head, clearly shocked. He said quietly, "This is unacceptable. This man has served our country, and they treat him like he's of no use to anyone. How is that possible?" A wave of indignation began to build up among those gathered. People who had initially just observed the situation now began to voice their opinions. One man, who looked like a businessman, became indignant. "What kind of country is this if a colonel bringing home a fallen soldier is not even given a ticket? It's a disgrace. Where is our respect?" At this time, several people approached Thomas Bryant to show their support. An elderly woman, who had been watching the situation from start to finish, stopped in front of him and said with a little excitement in her voice, "Colonel, I'm sorry you had to go through that. It wasn't fair. We all saw how they humiliated you, and we hurt for you." A young man with a cell phone in his hands, who was videotaping, nodded and added, "We're not gonna let this go unnoticed. People need to know how they treated you. I've already posted the video, and people are outraged. This needs to go to the highest levels of government." Thomas, though shocked by what had happened, still managed to keep his emotions in check. He nodded gratefully to the people who had supported him. For a moment, he felt that he was not alone in this fight for justice. He had a strange feeling that this incident could change something bigger than his own journey. One young woman, who was filming what was happening on her phone, did not hide her anger. "This is outrageous. How dare they do this? He's a colonel. He is bringing a soldier home. Why does our society need to be reminded of such things? I hope this video gets all over the news." Some people have already started posting the footage online with outrage comments and calls for justice. The post quickly gained views and spread further. Videos with titles like U.S. Army Colonel treated like a trespasser, humiliated officer doing his duty, and how our country has lost respect for its heroes quickly spread across social media. Among the comments came words of support and sympathy. "This is terrible. How is this even possible? I can't believe this is happening in our country. Where are our values and respect for those who defend our country?" Thomas stood silently watching as the people around him, some of whom had been indifferent at first, became his supporters. Everything that had happened before his eyes was taking on a new meaning. People were beginning to realize, albeit late, the injustice that the airport staff had done. One of the passengers, after waiting for the flow of people around him to dissipate a little, approached Thomas and held out his hand. "Colonel, we'll be on your side. We'll do everything we can to make sure no one can ignore what's been done to you. You deserve better." Bryant shook his hand gratefully. It made him feel a little better to know that people were not indifferent and were ready to defend his honor and dignity. While support from concerned passengers was growing, the airline's employees also noticed that the incident was beginning to attract attention from others and was already on their phones. The woman behind the counter, nervously glancing at the guards, exchanged quick remarks with a shift manager, a middle-aged man with a strained smile and a stern look. The manager approached Thomas, and despite his polite tone, his words sounded cold and detached. "Colonel Bryant," he began, giving his voice an authoritative tone, "unfortunately, due to your aggressive manner with our staff and creating a disturbance in the waiting area, we are forced to take additional measures." Bryant was stunned. An aggressive manner of speaking, disorderly behavior. He tried to remember when he had shown the slightest bit of aggression, but realized that it was just an excuse for the staff to justify their actions. His common polite requests were interpreted as inappropriate behavior, and now it became a reason for another humiliation. "What measures are we talking about?" the colonel asked discreetly, looking directly into the manager's eyes. The manager quickly backed away a step, as if not wanting to face his gaze, and continued, "Because of the incident you have provoked, we are forced to impose sanctions. For starters, your ticket has been permanently canceled, and you will not be able to use this flight or any other flights on our airline in the future. Your actions are unacceptable, and we cannot allow such situations on board." The words "in the future" and "canceled permanently" seemed to freeze in the air, and a rising wave of humiliation washed over Thomas. He was banned from all flights with this company, equated with an offender who deserved neither the right to transportation nor even the right to an explanation. "Are you serious?" Thomas asked, barely containing his anger. "I am escorting the remains of a soldier. I explained this situation to you calmly and respectfully, and for that you're going to ban me from flying." The manager did not waver. His voice was full of indifference and cold certainty. "Sir, we have a duty to protect our employees and passengers from the inconvenience you have caused. We don't care about the reasons for your actions. We are simply acting within our policy." At that moment, Thomas realized that to them he was not a man with a mission, but a convenient target for the application of rules, an outsider who could be easily punished and forgotten. His dignity, merit, and mission did not matter to these men. They wanted in one fell swoop to get rid of the inconvenient client he had become in their eyes. The passengers watching made a murmur of indignation at this measure. One man shouted indignantly, "This is too much. He was just trying to do his duty. You want to ban him from flying just because he asked for justice." But the manager was unwavering. His face remained cold, showing not a shred of sympathy or hesitation. He only added, "All decisions are final. Your support or dissatisfaction will not change anything. The company is acting in its own interests, and those interests are the safety and security of all passengers. And to you, Colonel, I bid you adieu." With these words, he turned and walked away, leaving Thomas standing among the indignant passengers, who had no doubt there was a clear and cruel injustice before them. After all that had happened, Colonel Brian felt a quiet, bitter feeling of resentment and disappointment growing in his chest. A man who had devoted his life to the defense of his country now found himself humiliated and denied the respect on which he had always based his principles. But despite all the injustice and pain, he knew he had to defend his honor. He decided that he would write a formal protest against the airline's actions and their rude, blatantly prejudicial attitude. When he found a quiet place at the airport, he sat down at a table and opened his laptop. Each word came hard to him, as if he were reliving the humiliation to which he had been subjected. He chose his words carefully, so that his letter would be poised and clear, and reflect the gravity of the situation and his deep resentment. He described how he was treated by the company's employees, how dismissive they were of his mission, and how their actions were colored by blatant bias and discrimination. The letter was emotional but respectful, and knew he had to show that, despite everything, he maintained his dignity. After sending the letter, he sat waiting for a response, feeling faint hope that the company would admit its mistakes and offer at least a minimal apology for the humiliation. It wasn't long before the reply came, standard and impersonal, like a cold formality that reeked of indifference. There was not even a hint of sympathy or a desire to consider his protest. The reply began dryly and formally, like an automated message. "Dear Mr. Bryant, we have received your complaint and have reviewed it carefully. We would like to inform you that the actions of our employees were carried out in strict compliance with our company's policies and standards. We are obliged to ensure the comfort and safety of all passengers and to adhere to our internal guidelines, according to which any disorderly conduct or actions that may cause inconvenience to other passengers are treated with special attention. Your case has been reviewed, and the company confirms that all of our employees' actions were consistent with the policy and did not violate the standards of professional conduct. We see no reason to change our decision, and your travel ban will remain in place. We thank you for your understanding and wish you good luck in your future travels." The words pierced him like a cold blade. There was nothing in them but indifferent formality and a hypocritical wish of good luck. Thomas saw a void in front of him, where there was no end of recognition of his merits, of the fact that his mission was bound up with the highest values of duty and honor. Their response sounded like a closed door, like a callous reminder that he was just another passenger who did not feed into their norms. The colonel clenched his fist tightly. He realized that his protest was nothing more than a piece of paper to them, another formality that they filed away in the archives, where similar complaints were piling up. Everything he'd been through was just a work situation for them, another case they'd rushed to close without regard for his merit or his pain. Thomas closed the laptop, feeling a cold rage growing in his soul. His integrity, his service, His mission all had been reduced to an empty formality, a set of standards that the airline placed above human dignity and respect. A few days later, when Brian had already returned home, his phone suddenly began to burst with calls and notifications. It turned out that videos and photos of the incident, taken by passengers at the airport, began circulating on social media at an astounding rate. People were shocked at how humiliatingly and unfairly the officers who was escorting the remains of the fallen soldier had been treated. Gradually, journalists began to join this public outrage. For them, it was a story that exposed the hidden, painful layers of discrimination and prejudice that sometimes manifested even against those who had dedicated their lives to serving the country. In the morning, Brian opened his email and found a slew of requests from various news outlets asking reporters to comment on the incident. Reporters offered to meet with him to tell his story, to show people that something like this could happen even to someone who deserves special respect. Once in the spotlight, he felt that his voice could finally be heard. At first, he was hesitant, unsure whether to reveal this humiliation in front of a wide audience, but he soon realized that his story could help many. A major TV news channel was the first to make contact. The journalist who called the colonel expressed deep indignation at what had happened and offered him the opportunity to tell his story live. Brian agreed, and the next day he was invited for an interview. In front of the cameras, Thomas, in his dress uniform, calmly and dignifiedly recounted everything he had been through. He spoke of the mission he had carried out, of his service and what had happened at the airport, of every humiliating look or an indifferent response he had received when he lodged his formal protest. The journalists listened intently, and many of them could not hide their surprise and anger as he described everything he had been through. "I have dedicated my life to serving, defending this country and those who live in it," he said at the end of the interview, "and I never thought I would face such blatant disregard and humiliation as I perform my last duty for a fallen comrade." This story is not just about me, it is about how easily we can forget respect and human dignity when we allow bias and formalism to take over. His words, sounding so simple and sincere, quickly went viral all over the internet. People shared the interview, discussing the incident and expressing their outrage in comments. Social media exploded with comments, posts and publications in which users expressed support for the colonel and condemned the airline's actions. Many emphasized that this was a blatant case of injustice and discrimination that became a symbol of deep societal problems. "How could they treat a man who serves the country in such a way?" wrote in the comments. "Why did the uniform and rank for which he risked his life not protect him from humiliation?" Others expressed their outrage at the airline's actions. "This is unacceptable. They should apologize and be held accountable for their actions." The next day, several leading newspapers published articles detailing the incident in its aftermath. One journalist wrote, "This story is not just an episode. It is a symptom of deep problems to which we can no longer remain indifferent." Brian was the victim of bias, blatant neglect, and callous formalism, but perhaps his story will be the spark that changes something in our system. The airline was under tremendous pressure. They started receiving thousands of messages and calls from outraged citizens, demanding explanations and public apologies. Many people stated that they would boycott their flights until the company admitted their mistake and changed their rules. A massive wave of criticism began, at which point the airline realized that the incident could no longer be simply hushed up or ignored. Colonel Bryant, who simply wanted to pay his last respects to his comrade, was now a symbol of the fight for justice and respect. He was pained that it had required such public humiliation, but he knew that at last his voice, and the voices of those who supported him, had been heard. The news of the unfair treatment of Thomas Bryant spread across the country like a fire in a dry forest. Social media, television, radio, all media outlets discussed the incident. People from all over the country expressed their outrage and bewilderment. How could it be that a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country faced such a blatant injustice on home soil? In a small Midwestern town, a group of veterans gathered for a spontaneous rally at the local memorial to fallen soldiers. One of them, retired Sergeant Michael Rogers, spoke excitedly into a microphone. "This is not just a case of discrimination. It is an insult to all of us who have worn the uniform. Colonel Bryant deserves our respect and support. We cannot stand by and let this kind of thing happen." His words were met with wild applause and shouts of approval. People held placards with inscriptions, "Respect for Heroes," Justice for Colonel Bryant. No discrimination. In major cities, the situation was even more tense. In New York City, Times Square was packed with people who came to show their solidarity with the colonel. Celebrities, public figures, and ordinary citizens addressed the crowd, calling for justice and respect for those who defend the country. "I can't be silent," famous actress Jessica Lawrence said from the stage. "My father was in the military, and I know how much he gave to this country. The way Colonel Bryant was treated is unacceptable. We have to do everything we can to make sure that it doesn't happen again." On social media, the hashtag Justice for Bryant became the #1 trend. People shared their stories, voiced their support, and demanded the airline take action. Many users called for a boycott of the company until it admits its mistake and makes a public apology. In Washington, D.C., at the Congressional Building, several senators brought the issue to the floor. Senator Robert Wilson spoke from the podium. "Gentlemen, we cannot turn a blind eye to such a blatant injustice. Colonel Bryant is a hero, and the way he was treated tarnishes our values and principles. I propose a formal investigation and action to protect the rights of our military." His proposal was welcomed by many colleagues. A special commission was formed to investigate the incident and make recommendations to prevent similar situations in the future. Meanwhile, the airline was under unprecedented pressure. Their hotline was overloaded with calls from outraged citizens, and the company's shares began to fall on the stock exchange. The company's management gathered for an emergency meeting, trying to find a way out of the situation. "We have to do something," the CEO said, wiping his forehead. "If we don't act, this could be a disaster for the company." Some suggested a public apology and reinstatement of the colonel. Others believed that it was necessary to stand firm and not give in to public pressure. But it was becoming obvious that without decisive action, the situation would only worsen. During this time, Colonel Bryant received countless messages of support. He received letters from people all over the country, from school children writing about how proud they were of him to veterans, expressing solidarity and willingness to help. One letter in particular touched his heart. It was from the mother of the very soldier he was accompanying. "Dear Colonel Bryant, I cannot express in words how grateful I am for all you have done for my son and for our family. I am deeply saddened to hear about what you have been going through. Please know that you have our support, and we are proud that you were there for our son on his final journey. With respect and gratitude, Mary Johnson." This letter reminded Thomas of what he had been serving for all this time. His pain and humiliation began to give way to a sense of responsibility and determination to see it through. Soon he received a call from a representative of a major human rights organization. "Colonel Bryant, we would like to offer you our assistance. We believe that your case could become an important precedent in the fight against discrimination and violation of military rights. We are ready to provide legal support and organize a campaign in your defense." Thomas, feeling the tremendous support from the community, agreed to cooperate. He realized that now it was not only about his personal story, but also about protecting the rights of many others who might have faced similar injustices. Meanwhile, the media continued to discuss the incident. There were debates on television, where experts, public figures, and military representatives discussed the issue of discrimination and respect for the military. Many called for a review of corporate policies and stricter monitoring of citizens' rights. This case shows how deeply rooted prejudice can be. Sociology professor James Harrison said in an interview, "We must work to eliminate discrimination in all its forms, especially when it affects those who defend our country." Public anger reached such a level that the country's president issued an official statement. "I am deeply concerned about the situation surrounding Colonel Thomas Bryant. Our military deserves the highest respect and support. I have instructed the relevant authorities to investigate and take the necessary measures to restore justice." This statement made the situation even more significant. People felt that their voices were heard at the highest level, and this gave hope for positive change. The airline, caught in the middle of the scandal, finally realized that it was no longer possible to ignore public opinion. They issued a statement in which they expressed regret for what had happened and promised to conduct an internal investigation. However, many people considered this insufficient and demanded concrete action and an apology directly to Colonel Bryant. Under pressure from the public and human rights organizations, the company management organized a meeting with Thomas. The meeting was attended by the media, and the whole country was eagerly awaiting its outcome. Colonel Bryant, in spite of all he had been through, held himself with dignity. He understood that his words and actions depended not only on his own honor, but also on the trust of many people who supported him. "I am not looking for revenge," he said at the meeting. "I want situations like this to never happen again. I want everyone, regardless of rank, appearance, or background, to be treated with respect and fairness." His words were met with applause. The airline's management finally publicly apologized to him and promised to change company policy, train staff, and do everything possible to restore public trust. Public anger gradually began to subside, giving way to hope for change. The incident provided a strong impetus for discussion of important social issues and aroused people's desire to fight for justice and equality. Colonel Bryant returned to his service, knowing that his story had not been in vain. He felt that despite the pain and humiliation, he had been able to contribute to the fight against injustice, and that gave him the strength to continue to serve his country with honor and dignity. The public outcry over the incident with Col. Thomas Bryant reached such proportions that his case became the subject of discussion at the highest level. In the Pentagon, the incident caused a wave of indignation and concern. Over the past few days, senior military officials, reviewing records, publications, and comments on them, could not believe that one of their officers, performing a sacred duty, could be so humiliated and deprived of the right to be treated with dignity. At an emergency meeting at the Pentagon, Army Commander Gen. Richard Westford, a man of impeccable reputation and boundless loyalty to his subordinates, openly expressed his outrage by addressing the audience. "This case is a disgrace to us all. We send our best men into the service to defend this country, and in return they get humiliation and neglect. Colonel Bryant is a hero, and I intend to seek justice." Representatives from the Department of Defense were also present at the meeting. The Secretary of Defense, who knew Bryant personally and appreciated his service, said the situation went beyond a simple conflict between the colonel and the airline. The case, in his view, raised the issue of the violation of the rights of the military and the unacceptability of discrimination against those who had dedicated their lives to serving their country. "We have an obligation to protect everyone who wears our country's uniform," he said, slapping his hand on the table. "If we don't, how can we expect our soldiers to continue to trust us?" It was decided to launch an official investigation. The commission included representatives of the Ministry of Defense, the Pentagon, and several experienced lawyers. The commission was to clarify all the circumstances of the incident, make a legal assessment of the actions of the airline and airport employees, and offer recommendations for protecting the rights of the military in the future. Over the course of several days, the commission collected evidence, surveillance footage, video footage taken by passengers, and witness statements. Employees of the airline were also invited, including management, who initially tried to distance themselves from the incident, considering it an internal company problem. However, under pressure from the commission and the public, they were forced to provide explanations for their actions. At a closed hearing organized by the War Department, the airline's chief of security, Mr. Douglas Hartley, was called to testify. In the presence of military officials, he nervously adjusted his tie and tried to find an explanation for his team's actions, but his excuses sounded weaker and more unconvincing under the stares of the panel. "We were just following protocols," he tried to justify himself, rubbing his palms together. "Our officers were acting under instructions, and they had reason to deny service to the colonel." "Grounds," General Westford interrupted him, his voice sounding like thunder. "Grounds to humiliate an officer's doing his last duty to a fallen soldier. On what grounds did they do it?" Mr. Hartley hesitated, unable to find a decent answer. He knew that any excuse would sound unconvincing, and his careless and callous words about protocols only heightened the tension in the room. Military and government representatives didn't want to hear about formalities. To them, this case was an insult and a failure in a system that is supposed to protect everyone who wears a uniform. Further testimony was also given by rank-and-file airline employees who handled Colonel Bryant's check-in. The employees' testimony was filled with excuses and attempts to shift responsibility to management, to higher protocols and general guidelines. Among them, however, was a female employee who later admitted that she felt uncomfortable about what was happening, but was made to understand that it was none of her business, and that the company always makes decisions in the best interest of its customers. At the same time, the Department of Defense and military human rights organizations began collecting information about other similar cases. It turned out that Colonel Bryant's case was not an isolated one. Over the past few years, several military personnel had also experienced rudeness, prejudice, and even denial of service from various companies. These cases rarely came to light because many military personnel were reluctant to go to court or public organizations, preferring not to bring the situation to light. This incident was the catalyst that raised a long-standing issue, and the military decided to fight to ensure that such incidents do not happen again. The president, who had already made a statement on the matter, decided to have a private meeting with Col. Bryant. This meeting became a highly publicized event. The president expressed his support and emphasized that the colonel's service and mission should not be questioned. He assured Thomas that the government would make every effort to enact reforms and protect the rights of the military. Colonel Bryant, the president said, shaking his hand firmly in front of the cameras, "You deserve our full respect. I personally guarantee that there will be no consequences for this incident. We will not tolerate such treatment of those who serve our country." After this meeting, work began on a draft law that would protect the rights of military personnel at civilian facilities. The draft law would impose strict measures against companies that discriminate against or humiliate military personnel, and would require civilian companies to train personnel to work with veterans and active military personnel. The law also called for the creation of a hotline through which military personnel could report incidents of bias, discrimination, or injustice. For the airline at the center of the scandal, the situation was catastrophic. The commission recommended sanctions for it and required management to publicly apologize to Colonel Bryant and all veterans. As a result of these demands, the company's CEO issued an official statement expressing regret for what had happened and promising that it would not happen again. The company announced that it would revise its protocols, introduce special courses on how to deal with military and veterans, and promised that its employees would receive regular training on the topic of respect and ethics. Colonel Bryant received an official apology from the company, and his name became a symbol of the fight for the rights and dignity of those who dedicated their lives to defending the homeland. He knew that this change would not have happened without the support of the community, without the efforts of everyone who cared about his story. Bryant realized that his fight for justice had taken on a much larger meaning and helped expose systemic problems that many people preferred to keep silent about. Upon completion of the investigation and adoption of reforms, many people, including colleagues, associates, and ordinary citizens, expressed their gratitude to him. For many, he became an example of fortitude and courage, not only on the battlefield, but also in everyday life, when the struggle for justice requires considerable fortitude. Colonel Bryant knew that his case had changed the system. He had managed to turn pain and humiliation into a tool to fight for justice. Now everyone who wore the uniform could feel a little more secure. Thomas, remembering everything he had been through, realized that his story was an important lesson for everyone, that respect for those who serve their country should be an integral part of community values and civic responsibility. After weeks of public outrage, pressure from human rights organizations, and demands for an investigation from the military, the airline finally decided to issue a public apology. In that evening, the CEO made an official statement to the camera. He, trying to appear sincere, began with, "We deeply regret the incident involving Col. Thomas Bryant. It does not reflect the values of our company, and we apologize to him and his family. We realize that this incident has hurt many of our passengers and the entire community." But his words sounded strained, as if each word was difficult to say. There was a look of disbelief on the faces of the audience, many of whom felt that the apology was a formality, a belated attempt to save their reputations. The apology was not accompanied by concrete measures, no layoffs, no significant changes in the company, and this only added to the doubts about the sincerity of the statement. On social media, the apology was met with disbelief by the public. One comment under the video read, "They are only apologizing because they have to. If it wasn't for the publicity, this would never have happened." Colonel Bryant, upon hearing of the public apology, remained calm. It was clear to him that Although public pressure had succeeded, he had not seen any real remorse or change from the company. Colonel Bryant, realizing the significance of what had happened and the public scrutiny, decided to reach out to the people who had supported him during this difficult time. After a week of heated discussions, amidst a belated apology from the airline, he organized a short speech that was broadcast on national channels and social media. On this day, Thomas looked collected and determined, but his voice still betrayed the depth of the humiliation he had suffered. "Dear compatriots," he began, looking directly into the camera, "I want to express my sincere gratitude to everyone who has remained indifferent to my story and become my support. Your words of support have given me the strength to get through this and remind me that the values we serve are alive in all of us." His voice was firm, but there was sincere gratitude in it. The colonel did not accuse the airline, nor did he talk about the humiliation he had suffered, avoiding negativity. Instead, he chose the path of dignity and honor, preferring to focus on the important lesson everyone could learn from the situation. This case is a reminder of how important it is for each of us to show respect and dignity to others. Those who serve the homeland do not do so for privilege or special treatment. We serve because we believe in the values that unite us, and to see people across the country stand up for me is the highest reward for any military person. His words drew a warm response from the audience and became a symbol of resilience in the face of injustice. Bryant emphasized that his goal is not to exacerbate conflict, but to move toward a better society where everyone, regardless of rank or title, is respected and heard. He concluded by adding, "Thank you to everyone who has helped me maintain my dignity in my time of need. Your support is not just for me, but for all those who serve this country. Together, we can make our world a more just place. Thank you for that." After his speech, many remarked that the colonel had set a true example of honor and self-control. His address inspired thousands of people, reminding them that even in difficult times, one can remain true to one's principles and respond to injustice with respect and dignity. The story of Col. Thomas Bryant has spread across the country, gaining new interpretations and discussions. It has been discussed not only as a case of discrimination, but also as a powerful example of the importance of respect and humanity for everyone. This story has touched many sectors of society and made people think about the fundamental values that are often taken for granted. Colonel Bryant showed by his behavior that honor, dignity, and respect for others are not just words, but principles to live by, even when faced with adversity. His resilience in the face of humiliation, his calm response to the airline's public apology, and his gratitude to the people who supported him have made his story a symbol of fortitude and honor. This story was a lesson not only about the problems of discrimination and bias, but also about how easy it is to forget basic principles of respect when it comes to power, commerce, or formalism. It showed that formal protocols and corporate rules can never come before human dignity. When these principles are ignored, the consequences can be devastating not only for those who are humiliated, but for the whole of society. The case of the colonel was a catalyst for change. In the aftermath of the incident, society became much more sensitive to the rights of military personnel, veterans, and anyone else who faces bias. A new law was passed that protects the rights of military personnel on civilian installations, as well as requiring companies to mandate respect and ethics training for employees. Many other companies have begun to revise their internal protocols to avoid similar situations. Young people, school children, and students, inspired by the colonel's story, began to actively discuss issues of honor, respect, and mutual assistance. Schools held lessons on the subject, where teachers taught that a person's true strength lies in his ability to face injustice with dignity and honor. Colonel Bryant became an example for new generations, an example that sometimes one man, following his principles, can change an entire system. Bryant himself, returning to ordinary life, realized that his story had taken on a much greater meaning. What began as a personal humiliation had become an important lesson for millions of people. He knew that his story had become a voice for anyone who had ever experienced injustice, for those who wanted to be heard but didn't know how to speak up. Subsequently, when reporters asked him questions about how he felt, Bryant's response was simple: "If this story teaches even one person to show more respect for others, then it wasn't all for nothing." Kyle, Brian's story has been remembered by the community as a reminder that each of us should strive to be decent, honest, and respectful. It was a story of how a lack of respect and compassion can lead to humiliation and pain, but also that even in these situations, a person can remain true to their principles and teach a powerful lesson to the entire community. That is how Colonel Brian's story became a lesson to all, a lesson about the importance of dignity, support, and respect. He reminded everyone that honor is not just a word, but a principle that should guide us through all of life's challenges. Friends, what do you think about this story? Share your thoughts in the comments. Perhaps you, too, have had cases of injustice or bias that you have experienced. We would love to hear your stories and your voices. You are our backbone, and each and every one of you is incredibly important to us. Thank you for supporting our channel, watching our videos, sharing your thoughts and experiences. We appreciate each and every one of you. If you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe and like it to stay up to date with new stories and important topics. We wish you a good day and peace in your soul. Thank you for being with us.